Well, guys, it's great to see you. It's great being with you, and I want to welcome every single one of you that are here. If this is your first time to North Point, or if you're coming a while, or maybe you came last week with Camp 75, somebody invited you, and then you're coming back this week, and it's kind of week 2 of North Point, or maybe you're watching or listening online. Really, however you've come, I just want you to know I am so incredibly grateful that you're here. Because, guys, we're in part 2 of this incredibly important series called Guardrails. And if you weren't here last week, I want to catch you up on what we're saying and what we're talking about throughout this series. And so I'm going to explain, what this series is about and why we're doing this series. And so that should be helpful if you weren't here last week. But if you were here last week, this is going to be kind of a reminder, but hopefully it's a helpful reminder to kind of give you direction where we're going today as well. So last week when we kicked this whole thing off, one of the things I gave you is a definition of a guardrail. And here's what we said. We said a guardrail is a system designed to keep vehicles from straying into dangerous or off-limit areas. And we've all seen these. This is nothing new. Like we've seen guardrails on roadways, on medians, curves, bridges, all around our roadways and highways. And a guardrail really serves 2 purposes. It serves a purpose to direct and protect. That's the purpose of a guardrail, to direct us and to protect us. And something I'm personally grateful for when it comes to a guardrail is that guardrails are designed to minimize damage. And last week I shared a story with you guys about, when I got a new car. To me, it was a used car, but it was a new used car. And it was a Honda Prelude, and I was so excited about it. And, I was driving in Austin one night, and I remember, I shared this story that I jumped a curb, and then I smashed into a guardrail. And I'm so grateful for that guardrail because it prevented me from having a head-on collision with an Austin police officer. In other words, the guardrail, which is great, but the guardrail minimized the damage. And that's the nature of a guardrail. Guardrails, you hit a guardrail, you may have to take your car to the shop, but at least you don't have to go to the hospital. Guardrails minimize damage. Now, I don't think any of that's new. I don't think anybody's sitting here going like, wow, I'm so excited to learn about guardrails today. So excited, I came to church and you're giving me these definitions. And perhaps there's the question, which would be a natural question to go, why are we talking about this? What does this have to do with my life? And what we said last week is that roadways and highways are not the only place that we need guardrails, but we also need guardrails in every single one of our lives. Because if we're brutally honest with one another, if we're just totally honest, what we know as we look back on life is some of our greatest regrets in life, some of our greatest relational regrets, financial regrets, whatever kind of regrets in our life, some of our greatest regrets in life could have been prevented if we simply had established some guardrails, some financial guardrails, some moral guardrails, some ethical guardrails, some dating guardrails, some parenting guardrails, or even some spiritual guardrails. In other words, what we know is that if we had simply established some guardrails, it could have prevented or either minimized the regret in our life. And there's a huge implication to that for you and for me. And the implication is this, is that you and I today, this week, today, we can make decisions that have the potential to prevent or minimize future regret in our life. And that's why this is such a big deal. That's why this is such an important series for every single one of us, regardless if you're a Christian or not. Now, something that makes personal guardrails difficult, or one of the things that makes it difficult, and we talked about this last week, is that culture. See, in culture, as we think about culture, and my point is, again, not to knock culture or to say culture's bad. I'm just making an observation. Culture doesn't encourage guardrails. Culture doesn't like the word no. Culture doesn't like the idea to say, hey, you can't experience that. You can't cross that line. Like, hey, some can go there, but the answer is no. We don't like that. And I get that. I don't like the word no. But just an observation, culture doesn't encourage guardrails. Culture encourages gray lines. Culture likes gray lines. Gray lines like this. These statements kind of encompass it. Be careful, be cautious, be responsible. Wait until you're ready. Follow your heart. Do what makes you happy. Now, again, I'm not against these statements. I would actually agree with these statements. My point and the observation we're making is these are not guardrails. These are gray lines. Because what does it actually mean to be responsible? What's that mean for you, or what's that mean for me? What does it mean to be cautious? Like, how far do you go until you're not cautious? What are the lines there? And what does it mean to wait until you're ready? Because the implication of being ready is you've done certain things to prepare yourself to be ready. So what are those things? What are those things for you? What are those things for me? And the further you think about these statements, which again, I'm not against these statements at all. I'm just making an observation to say, the more you think about this, the more you realize culture encourages gray lines. And the other thing that makes this really confusing and difficult, and we alluded to this last week, is that if you decide to establish personal guardrails in your life, you need to know this. Culture will laugh at you. Culture will make fun of you. Culture will say, like, are you kidding me? You're so archaic. You're so old school. If you decide to make personal guardrails in your life, culture will laugh at you. But at the exact same time, culture will shame you and mock you because your marriage is in a ditch. Your finances are in a ditch. Your parenting is in a ditch. Or you're struggling with some sort of addiction. In other words, if we had to kind of boil this down, we said this statement. We said, if you decide to establish personal guardrails, you may not be celebrated in school. Your classmates or your other students or even on social media will make fun of you. They're not going to celebrate you. Or in your family, in your workplace, you will not be celebrated. But you will have fewer regrets in your life. And that's what I want for you. And that's what I want for me. So this is why we're talking about this. This is important stuff. Now, today as we continue this discussion, we're basically, we're in part 2. Today I want to talk about what I would arguably say is the most important guardrail you could establish in your life. As I think about your life, as I think about my life, I would arguably say the thing we're going to talk about today, the personal guardrail we're going to talk about today, is the absolute most important guardrail that we could have a discussion around. And what I want us to talk about today is this: a personal guardrail around your heart, around my heart. And so as you think about that, I want to explain to you why I would say that this is the most important guardrail that we could establish. And to do that, I want to talk about somebody who actually lived 3,000 years ago. And the individual who lived 3,000 years ago is this guy right here, Solomon. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Solomon or his story, but his story, it's a fascinating, fascinating story. I mean, Solomon was one of the kings of Israel. He was the son of King David, and then he established, he was one of the kings of Israel. And under his rulership, or under his, kingship, he ushered in the golden age of Israel. And this is important to know. I mean, under his leadership, Israel experienced more peace, more prosperity, more power than ever before in its history or in its history afterwards. That's under King Solomon. He was an unbelievable leader. And King Solomon, the ancients would say about King Solomon, they would say he's the wisest man ever to live. In other words, think of it this way, that God gave him like a tenfold dose of wisdom. In other words, he had more comprehension, more ability to connect the dots in life, like a higher level of wisdom than any other human being to live. He was brilliant in every sense of the way. And there are lots of people today who would argue and say, yes, Solomon is the wisest man ever to live. He was the most powerful man in his time, in his generation. He was the most powerful man in the world. I mean, he had that kind of power. It's just fascinating, fascinating story. And not only was he powerful, but he was also the richest human being ever to live. In fact, think about this. Let's just pause a second. Think about it this way. Do you guys know who this individual is right here? Anybody know who that is? Starts with Jeff Bezos. Yeah, you guys familiar with him? Now, Jeff, he invented this small company. You may have heard of it, called Amazon. You guys heard of that? It's kind of like the Walmart of, the internet, right? Now, Jeff, just so you know, he's the richest man on our planet today. And do you know what his net worth is? Jeff's net worth is $143 billion. I mean, think about that. That seems like it would just blow your mind. Personally, if you had $143 billion, I mean, that's almost incomprehensible, like what that could do in your life and your family. And like you just go, man, that's mind-blowing. So capture that in your mind. Think about it. That's Jeff, the richest man in the world today. When you think about Solomon in comparison, Solomon's personal net worth is $2.3 trillion. Not with an M, not with a B, but with a T, trillion dollars. I mean, that's Solomon. That's got to be mind-blowing to think about. Look at this guy. So here you have this incredible leader that put Israel on the map, if you will, in the golden age of Israel, that was the most powerful man in the world, who was the richest man ever to live in human history, had an incredible sense of wisdom and how life is connected. And Solomon wrote 3 letters in the Bible. He wrote the letter of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And Proverbs is just full of all these wise statements about life. Ecclesiastes is a letter about meaning and purpose in life. And then the letter of Song of Solomon is the letter about sex and sexuality. In fact, Jewish boys couldn't read this letter until they were like 12 or 13. I mean, it's so kind of, risque, right? And that's Solomon. Well, I'm telling you, Solomon in his life accomplished so many things, created one of the wonders of the world. And Solomon as an old man, after all the successes and all the regrets in life, as an old man, he kind of looks back on his whole life and he makes a statement that is so important for us to understand. And here's what he says: above all else. In other words, the wisest man who's ever lived said, above all else, more important than anything else in life is to guard your heart. Why, Solomon? Why would you say that's the most important thing? He tells us, for everything you do flows from it. Everything you think, everything you feel, everything that you desire in life, the way you treat your husband, the way you treat your wife, the way you treat your friends, the moral lines you want to cross, what you want to accomplish in business, what you want to have, like your possessions, every single thing in life comes from the heart. That's what the wisest man who ever lived said. And then, fast forward 1,000 years later, Jesus shows up on the scene. And when you read the teachings of Jesus, do you know what Jesus says over and over and over and over? Throughout the teachings of Jesus, he says these words: from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, what's in us is going to come out of us. And when you think about that, and you think, here's the wisest man ever to live, and here's the Son of the living God, and both of them tell us and teach us that above all else, guard your heart. For everything in life, it comes from within. What if that's true? What if everything you feel and desire and want? What if the words that leave your mouth, what if all of your actions actually come from here? Well, the wisest man who ever lived and the Son of the living God said that's true. And if that's true, then learning to guard your heart is the most important thing you and I could do. So, the question is, what does that look like, right? Because I don't think any of what I've just said to you is new. I don't think any of you are sitting here going, oh man, that's an epiphany. Wow, I didn't know that. I think all of us have seen this, experienced this. We say things and do things. We've seen relationships around us where, this stuff in us will come out of us and it can lead to some of life's greatest regrets. I don't think any of this is new, but the question is, how do you do this? How do you guard your heart? So for the rest of our time, that's what I want to talk about. I want us all collectively together to think together, to have this discussion together with the outcome of what does it look like to guard every single one of our hearts. So to do that, what I want to do is I want to introduce you to the 4 biggest emotions that I would say are inside your heart and my heart. And it really doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. These 4 emotions are universal for all of us. This is not, a Christian thing. This is a human thing. This is all of us. We will bump into these 4 big emotions. And if we don't put some guardrails around these 4 big emotions that we're going to talk about today, honestly, it can lead to some of life's greatest regrets. So the 4 emotions I want us to talk about that I think we all bump into are these 4 right up here. Guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. Guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. Now, before we jump in and I begin to explain what these are and then we begin to talk about the guardrails around each of these, let me just, on the kind of the outset of this conversation, just say this. Listen, what we're going to talk about today is a lot of information. So prepare yourselves. There's going to be a lot of things we're going to talk about. And honestly, this could be like a 4-part series, an 8-part series where we talk about each one of these and kind of, take it apart, deconstruct it, talk about psychology and talk about how God views it and all this kind. We could spend a lot of time on this. So I just want you to know that I know this is going to be a lot of information. So in light of that, my hope today for you is that you would not perhaps, process all the information, but that one of these emotions, just one of these emotions, that you would resonate with. That my hope for you is that you would connect with one of these emotions and that you would walk out these doors and say, you know what? It's almost like God prepared me to hear what I heard today in this one emotion, and now I have a new tool. Now I understand how to put a personal guardrail around that specific area. So here we go. Let's begin the discussion around these 4 big emotions. The first one is guilt. See, guilt has a voice. Guilt has a voice internally inside of you and inside of me. And here's what guilt says. Guilt says, I owe you. Guilt says, I owe you an apology. I owe you money. I owe you a car. I owe you a reputation because I took something from you. Right? I took that reputation because what I did online on social media ruined your reputation. I spread the gossip and spread the rumor. I owe you something. I stole some money from you. And now all of a sudden I have this emotion inside of me that I'm carrying with me that goes, man, I owe you that money back. That's guilt. Now, the thing that's interesting with guilt is oftentimes we try to hide our guilt. Right? When we mess up or there's a line we cross or we do something, we try to hide it. We try to kind of keep it secret. And with guilt, we try to do this. We think to ourselves, we say, as long as no one knows, everything will be okay. As long as no one knows about this thing, everything will be okay. So we try to cover it up. We try to cope with it, all kinds of coping mechanisms, all these things we do to cover up our guilt, because we don't want anyone to see it. But if you're here today and you have guilt in your life, you know that's a myth. As long as no one knows, everything will be okay. You know that's a myth because it's coming out of you, isn't it? I mean, when we carry guilt with us, guilt creates secrets. Guilt says, hey, I'm not going to tell you the full truth. I may tell you 80% of the truth, but I'm not going to tell you 100% of the truth because I want to protect what I've done. I don't want you to see that. Guilt puts up walls in our relationships and in our life. Guilt says, hey, I'm going to put this wall over here and this wall over here. I don't want you to see what's happening inside of me. Guilt lies upon lies upon lies upon lies because guilt, you're trying to hide it. So you cover it up with a lie. Then you got to remember that lie. Then you got to lie upon lie upon lie to build the wall. Or guilt creates a distance in relationships. And maybe you've experienced this. Maybe on the other side, of your spouse, or maybe, think of it this way, as a husband, you come home and your wife says, what's wrong? And you say, nothing. And then the next day, what's wrong? Nothing. Next day, what's wrong? Nothing. What's wrong? Nothing. What's wrong? Nothing. Nothing. Just leave me alone. I'm fine. Just let me watch some TV, drink a beer. I'm just fine. And why are we watching TV and drinking a beer oftentimes? It's to cover the guilt inside of us. Guilt says, I owe you. That's guilt. How about anger? How about this one? Anger pretty much says the opposite. Anger says, you owe me. That's the voice of anger. Anger is the opposite end of this, to say, hey, there's something you did. You took something from me. You said something to me. You owe me. You owe me that job because you said something that cost me that job. You owe me a first marriage because you left, and now you owe me a first marriage. You owe me tucking me in at night as a little boy and little girl because dad, you left, mom, you left, and I'm not tucked in. You owe me. That's the voice of anger. In fact, anger inside of us leads to us thinking this. We think this statement. We say, you pay me back or I will pay you back. That's anger. Hey, you better pay me back or I'm going to pay you back. And we pay people back in all kinds of different ways. We're passive aggressive. or we're moody, or we say things on social media, or we say things in their presence, or we say things to others to punish them. And our hope is, man, I'm going to punish you so that one day you can pay me back. But there's a flaw in this. And the flaw is, a person can't fully repay. They can't. Imagine this. If somebody took $1,000 from you, that individual stole $1,000 from you, went off, had a good time, but then came back 2 weeks later and said, man, I'm so sorry. Here's the deal. Here's your $1,000 back. What do you feel when they gave you $1,000 back? Well, part of you is going to be like, that's cool. But the other part of you goes, there's still distance between you and I. I mean, you stole from me. You can't fully repay that. Well, what if they paid you 5 times over? What if they paid you $5,000 back? You're like, that is cool. But still, every single time you see that person who stole the $1,000 from you, what do you feel even though they've paid you 5 times over? There's this gap. I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if you are trustworthy. The reason why is because you can't fully repay the person. And that leads to another challenge when it comes to anger. And the other challenge is this, is anger is never isolated to the relationship of origin. It's never isolated to the one who did something to you that created the anger within you. See, anger leaks. Anger gets out on the people we love the most, but it's not the person who created the offense. And I thought about that this week, and I thought to myself, man, I've done this so many times. Somebody made me angry at work, and I go home and I take it out on my kids. Somebody made me, angry at home, and I come to work and take it out on the people at work. I mean, anger leaks. And as I thought about this personally, I thought, an area for me that anger has leaked, and it really had nothing to do with the people that I was hurting, is when it comes to parenting, when it comes to my boys. In fact, I think one of the greatest regrets of my entire life, as I look back at my whole life, is what I did to my sons the first 5 to 8 years of their life. And to explain what I mean by that and explain why this is one of my greatest regrets is, for me, growing up in my home, when I was a little boy, growing up in my home, what I experienced on the other side of my father all the time was this word shame. Is this idea of shame. Shame's the idea that you are a mess up. You're screwed up. There's something wrong with you. That's what I experienced on the other side of my dad. And when I would mess up, when I would do something as a 5-year-old, as a 7-year-old, my dad would explode in anger and he would say to me, what the hell's wrong with you? What the hell's wrong with you, Buck? He would say that constantly. And as a 7-year-old, I'm trying to process this, going like, what do you mean? I didn't know anything's wrong with me. I just think I made a foolish choice. That's it. You see, there's a big difference between saying, you're my son, I love you, you've made an unwise choice. It separates identity, value, and worth from the choice they've made. My father didn't do that. My father shamed me. And over and over when I would mess up, I would hear either what the hell's wrong with you or you are a blank up. And then I remember when I was 10, my father came out inside and he was full of anger. And he looks at me when I'm in the yard playing with my buddies. And he looks at me full of anger with these huge eyes. And he says, if your mother and I ever get divorced, it's your fault. It's your fault. And that's the home I grew up in. And I had all kinds of anger with my father. And then Jill and I get married and we start having a bunch of kids. And I love all 5 of my boys, but come on, when you have that many kids, it's like trying to wrangle them and you're like, test every ounce of your patience and all this stuff. And here's what I begin to do. All of a sudden, when they're not doing what I want them to do, or they're like, acting up or doing this kind of thing, all of a sudden what started to come out of me was what my father did. And I would look at my son Sam or Timbo and I'd say, what the hell's wrong with you? What are you doing? What are you thinking? And then as a pastor, I would attach some Bible verses. And I would say, hey, don't you know, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. You're not pleasing the Lord. And it was shame, anger coming out on my sons. And over the last 5 to 10 years of my life, I've been able to see that clear and clear and clear, and I had no idea what I was doing. It's one of my greatest regrets in my life. And it points us back to this statement. Anger is never isolated to the relationship of origin. It leaks out of us. And sometimes it hurts the people we love the most who had nothing to do with what we're angry about. It's anger. Anger has a voice that says, you owe me. Then we have greed. And greed has a voice, and the voice of greed says, I owe me. Greed is all about me, my, I. It's my money, it's my time. Don't you dare ask for it. Don't you dare push on that. I mean, it's my stuff, right? I mean, that's greed. And greed is the idea that when there's something in the community, when there's something at your local church, to invest your time or to invest your money or to do that on a consistent basis. I mean, greed rises up inside of us and says, no way, that ain't going to happen. That ain't going to happen. But listen, I feel bad for you. I'm sorry about that, but I'm not sorry enough to give you money. I'm not sorry enough to give you my time. That is greed. And I'm just telling you guys, I mean, we're all friends here, right? We're just talking. I'm just telling you, greed masquerades. Greed is so tricky. You can't see greed in the mirror because you look in the mirror of culture and you know what it's going to reflect back to you? Oh, you're so wise. You're so smart with your money. You're such a good investor. You're brilliant with your time. You're so happy because of the way that you invest your time. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have fun and experience all these great things and be a good investor and be good with your money. That's not my point. My point is greed masquerades. Greed is tricky. Greed has a voice that says, I owe me. It's mine, it's all mine. And as a follower of Christ, come on, guys. This should be the last thing that describes us as followers of Christ, right? Because you think about the nature, kind of the idea of Christianity, God gave his one and only son for you and for me. We didn't deserve it, but he loved us, and he did what love required of him. He gave his one and only son. That's Christianity. And for us as Christians, when we are greedy, do you know what we're practically doing, what we're practically saying with our life, with our greed? We're practically saying there is no God because I put my hope and my trust and my confidence and my experiences in money, not in God who richly provides. That's greed. That's a big one. Greed says, I owe me. And then, jealousy. Jealousy says, life owes me. Jealousy says, hey, life is not fair. Jealousy says, you know what? I should have got the promotion. I mean, I worked 10 times as hard as them. Jealousy says, I should have had that kind of vacation. How dare they have that kind of vacation? I mean, don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I've gone through in life? I should have what they should have, what they have. I should have that house, that car, that boat, that experience. My marriage should be like that. I deserve that marriage. Life is not fair because life owes me. And one of the ugliest things we do with jealousy is with the emotion of jealousy, we listen to that little still voice inside of us that celebrates the failure of others. When she didn't make the team, all of a sudden there's something inside of us that celebrates and goes, yes. When her looks, because of these things that happened in her life, she used to look like this, but now she doesn't look like that. There's this little thing inside of us that begins to secretly celebrate their failure. When their kids didn't get into that school, when their marriage starts to go south, jealousy, one of the ugliest things about jealousy is it celebrates the failures of other individuals. So, as we talk about this, these four big emotions that, regardless if you're a Christian or not, that we bump into, which one do you resonate with the most? Which one, as you walk through those doors, you didn't know what we were going to talk about, but as you walk through those doors, which is the one that kind of you're bumping into? Or that it's almost like God has been tapping you all week long, saying, hey, kiddo, pay attention to this. So the question is, what do we do with that? What are the guardrails that we can actually put around these emotions. Because if we don't put some guardrails around these emotions, that's what ultimately leads to some of life's greatest regrets. So I want to show you some of these guardrails. But before I do, let me just say one last thing. When it comes to this discussion and what we're talking about today, if you're here today and you're not a Christian, or if you're watching or listening online and you're not a Christian, I so respect the fact that you're here. I love that you're here. I really do. But I want you to know that I understand that you didn't sign up for any of this. I want you to know, I know that you didn't sign up to be a follower of Jesus Christ. So everything we're talking about today is optional. Like everything I'm talking about, don't feel like I'm pointing fingers at you, because you can kind of pick and choose and you can go, I like that. And especially as we talk about these guardrails, you can go like, I like that one, don't like that one. If you're not a follower of Christ, everything is optional. But if you are a follower of Christ, this is not optional. This is what our life should look like. And I think that's important to understand before we jump in to these personal guardrails. So with that said, what do we do if we're wrestling with guilt? It's one word. The guardrail is to confess. Now, this is really important that we understand what that means. See, confess is the idea we got to get it out of us. Whatever that thing we're putting walls around, whatever that thing we're keeping secret, whatever that thing we're believing the myth that says as long as nobody knows, everything will be okay, we got to get it out of us. We got to expose it to the light. And when I say confess, I'm not talking about perhaps what you learned in church. Hey, confess to the Lord and he is faithful and just and he's going to forgive you. It's always confess to God, confess to God, confess to God, confess to God. Now, I think that's part of it and that's another discussion, but come on, let's be honest. God already knows, right? It's not like when you confess to God, he's like, are you kidding me? You actually did that? I had no idea. Wow, God knows what you've done and he desires you to be healed. He desires you to be fully alive. And the guardrail around guilt is to confess. To confess to somebody in your life who has influence in your life. To confess to somebody who you have trust with. To confess to somebody who has your best interest in mind. To confess to somebody who loves you perhaps more than you love you. To confess to somebody who will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. That has life experience. That will speak words of wisdom into your life. It's to confess. And ultimately to confess to the one that you committed the offense against. Now, one of the reasons why we don't do this is because we have a fear of the outcome of the confession. In other words, if I tell that person, then that's going to damage this relationship. If I say that, it's going to cause damage in my marriage, it's going to cause damage with my kids, it's going to cause damage to my reputation. So that keeps us imprisoned. It shackles us because of that fear, right? And let me just be honest with you. You're right. If you decide to confess, it will create damage in your marriage, with that friendship, with your reputation. It will. But you have to understand it's temporary. Because remember the definition of a guardrail, one of the outcomes of a guardrail? Guardrails minimize the damage. Yes, there will be damage, but it is minimized. The same thing is true when you confess. Yes, there will be this instability. Yes, there will be some damage, but it leads to something so much greater. In other words, think about it this way. Short-term instability can lead to long-term intimacy. Short-term instability, that, I said that, now the things seem unstable. It ultimately leads to the thing you want the very most in your marriage, the very most with your kids, the very most with your friendships, the very most in your relationship, in your life, that long-term intimacy. And I've seen this time and time and time in my life to where, I've shared something or confessed something. I'm like, and it's so hard to get it out, but you get it out and it creates that damage initially, but then it begins to do some healing in you and healing around you. And it leads to that long-term intimacy. And I've seen this a lot of places in my life. One of the places I've seen this is when I was working at Dell. Now, I worked at Dell for about 10 years, and I worked in sales at Dell. And I remember at Dell, we all had these cubes, and that's where I worked. And on my kind of row of cubes, I had 5 guys that I was really close with. And these 5 guys, I worked out with, we went to lunch together, we laughed together, we shared life together. I mean, it was a lot of fun. And so we had this friendship. And I remember with these 5 guys, 3 of the 5 guys weren't followers of Christ. One other guy was. And on, with these guys, they would call me this certain name. The name they had for me, they call me Ice Deacon because they felt like my hair looked like Vanilla Ice or maybe Iceman. I prefer Iceman on Top Gun. But like my hair looked like, Vanilla Ice or Iceman, and they knew I was religious. So that's the way they phrased it. I went to church. So they called me Deacon, Ice Deacon. And so I had this relationship with these guys, and we had a lot of fun and camaraderie and all this good stuff. Well, one day I was talking to the guys, and we were all kind of, talking around the water cooler, if you will. And they knew I played golf, and so they asked me this question. They said, Buck, we know that you played a lot of golf growing up, went to college, played golf, all that good stuff. How good were you? How good were you? And I remember, without even blinking, I told them, I said, well, I was 4th in the nation. I was the 4th best golfer in the United States of America. And they looked at me and they were like, wow, that is amazing. And I was like, yeah, I know, when you got talent, you got talent, And so I said, we had that conversation. And then I remember afterward, got in my car and I sat there behind my steering wheel and I thought to myself, what have you done? What have you done? Because that's not even close to the truth. And I drove home and I was thinking, just how you replay this, like it happened so fast. Like I didn't even think about lying. And plus, like if you're going to say 4th in the nation, it's a lie. I thought to myself, you should have said 3rd or 2nd or 1st. I mean, just go for it if you're going. And so I'm driving home and I'm thinking, why did I do this? Why did I do this? Well, sometime later, I've discovered a lot about what's happening in here and insecurities and codependence. And it really came to the root of my father. And a lot of, my value and worth was so wrapped up in what people thought. And so I was willing to lie to them to make them like me. I was willing to lie to them for them to respect me even more so. So I drove home, and that night I could barely sleep. I woke up the next day and I said, I got to do something. I got to tell them. I got to confess. And so I remember that next day I got up in front of them and I just said, guys, I got to tell you something. This is super hard. It's very awkward, but here's the deal. Yesterday, you remember when I told you I was 4th in the nation? And they all kind of smirked and said, oh, yeah. I said, that's not true. It's a complete lie. And I'm really sorry. There's stuff in me. I just wanted you to like me more. And it's just weird to say that, but, that whole thing. And they looked at me with kind of this smirk and they began to laugh. And they said, Buck, we knew that. Like, there's just such a thing as an internet, we went to the internet, and we're like, this guy's not even close to that, right? And they knew that, but my point in sharing that with you is it did create some, instability in those relationships. It did create some damage of trust, like, I'm not so sure about you. But what it ultimately led to was long-term intimacy, because several of those guys began coming to church with me, we met together a bunch, and several of those guys actually crossed the line of faith and put their trust in Jesus Christ. So when it comes, to what do we do with that, the guilt inside of us? What do we do? It's to confess. It's to expose it to the light as hard as that is, as much as we may fear bringing it out here. But see, when it's exposed to the light, it not only brings healing to what that is, it also brings healing to those around. That's the guardrail for guilt. How about this one? When it comes to anger, the one word is to forgive. It's to forgive. Now, when it comes to forgiveness, I believe there's so much confusion, and really as a result of what the church has taught. And I think for years and years and years, perhaps in your life, the church is so cheap in forgiveness and said, hey, here's 1 or 2 verses, here's a prayer, go out, pray this verse, forgive your father, forgive your mom, forgive your ex-wife, your ex-husband for what they've done. Wake up tomorrow joyful. You're like, what? That makes no sense. It doesn't work, right? See, forgiveness is not something that happens overnight. Forgiveness is over time. It is a process. There are steps and stages of forgiveness. So if you and I were sitting down and we were talking about anger, which anger is ultimately unprocessed hurt, somebody hurts you, you haven't processed it, turns into anger, gets in a lot of people who didn't have anything to do with your anger. If we were talking about that and said, okay, what does this guardrail look like? How do you forgive? And we were having this conversation, I would ask you 4 questions. And I would say, you need your computer, you need a piece of paper, you need a pen. You've got to be intentional. You've got to write this stuff down. And it can take weeks, it can take months, and sometimes years, depending what happened. And the first question I would ask is this: what did they do? Honestly, what happened? Specifically, what did they do? Because if you don't get specific on what happened, It can be something that's far greater. All of a sudden, the emotion, the hurt, the pain, all those around it can cloud what actually happened. And it can make it huge or it can minimize it. So the first question is, what happened? What did they do? Was it a 5-minute act when you were 14? Was it those words that your mom said? Was it what your ex-husband, specifically what he did? To write it down, to get very specific, to know exactly what it is they did. And then to ask the question, what do I struggle with as a result? You know, I've shared with you guys as a result of what my dad did, you know, I really struggle with value and self-worth and, you know, my identity. And so what did I do with that? Well, I work and work and work and achieve and success. I mean, I just chase at the neglect of my family because somehow I think if I can accomplish this, then I'll feel valuable, I'll feel worthy, right? I've struggled with that my whole life. What specifically did they do? What do you struggle with as a result? And then to ask, what do they owe me? What is it that they really owe you? You know, my father owes me a childhood. But the problem with that is he can't go back. There's no rewind button in life. I can't go back to when I was 10 years old and he said that statement. But to identify, what is it that they owe you? A first marriage? Tucking you in as a little boy or little girl at night? You know, they didn't do that. That's what they owe you. They owe you some money. They owe you reputation. Specifically, what is that? And ultimately, where you're going to get with this question is they can't repay the debt. As we alluded to earlier, they can pay you 5 times over, but they can't fully repay the debt, which leads us to the fourth question, which is, will I cancel the debt? Will I get to the place, as I'm kind of being intentional, I'm writing this down, I'm going through this process, it's not a linear process, you go back and forth to these 4 questions, and then you get to the place to go, will I cancel the debt and say, you don't owe me that any longer? And if you're a follower of Christ, I would highly encourage you, and I know this is a little bit cliche, but I would highly encourage you to spend as much time as you possibly can at the foot of the cross and to look in the face of Jesus Christ and see how his love was demonstrated for you and see what he did for you and to see that he was willing to give his life as a sacrifice for your sin. And he paid for that. And the longer you spend looking at what Christ has done for you, not only will you come to the realization that he paid for your sin, but he also paid for their sin. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, one of the things that empowers you to actually forgive and say, the debt is canceled, you don't owe me that any longer, is what Jesus Christ has done for you. Now, the idea of saying you don't owe me, I understand the emotional pushback on that. The emotional pushback is, well, if I say they don't owe me, I'm letting them off the hook. That's what they committed the crime, they did that thing. I say you don't owe me any longer, I'm letting them off the hook. And you're right, you are. But guess who else you're letting off the hook? You're letting you off the hook. And you're letting those around you that have experienced the anger as a result of that off the hook. That's why forgiveness is said, forgiveness equals freedom. Freedom for you and freedom for those around you. When it comes to anger, the guardrail is to forgive. When it comes to greed, one of the things we can do when greed is there is to give, to be extraordinarily generous. To say, when there's opportunity to give, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write a big old check, or I'm going to get on my phone and transfer those funds. And when I do that, I'm going to say to greed, you don't control me any longer. When it comes to my time, and there's an opportunity to serve, or there's an opportunity to invest in the next generation, or there's an opportunity to get engaged, you know what? I'm going to say, I'm in. I am going to be extraordinarily generous with my money and my time. And by doing so, you are saying to greed, you no longer control me. And what's fascinating about giving is that you can read all kinds of books today, all kinds of blogs, all kinds of articles about people who aren't followers of Jesus Christ, and they will tell you that happiness and joy in life is found when you give your life away. And the same thing is true as followers of Jesus Christ. When you talk to followers of Jesus Christ who think Christianity is an adventure and you're like, man, it's a life for you. One of the reasons why it's a life is because they've decided to be extraordinarily generous with their money and with their time. And they've decided to say, my hope and my confidence and my security is not my stuff. It's in my heavenly Father who richly provides. Greed is to be extraordinarily generous. The last guardrail is with jealousy. It's to celebrate. It's to do this. It's to answer this or to make this statement. To celebrate what God has given you. And to do this out loud. So this is in your car. This is in your bathroom. This is in your shower. This is when, just to say this out loud. Perhaps in the mornings to say, hey, I am so grateful. I just want to celebrate and thank God for, this car. I know it doesn't have AC, but man, I'm thankful for it. It's hot, but I'm so thankful. Because if you have a car, you are so rich. You really are. Or to be thankful for this house. I know it's 1,100 square foot house, but man, I love it. I'm so thankful. To be thankful that you have a refrigerator in the garage. That means you have 2 refrigerators. Wow. I'm so thankful. And I'm serious, every time you say this out loud, you are saying to jealousy, you will not control me. And not only that, but it's to celebrate what God has given others out loud. For example, that promotion that you felt like you deserved. And Frank got the promotion. To walk up to Frank and to say, Frank, I just want to let you know that I want to congratulate you for the promotion that you got, that I felt like I deserved, and I felt like it's unfair, and I felt like I should have gotten it. No, don't say that. Don't say that. But just be honest and just say, hey, Frank, I just want to congratulate you. I'm authentically happy for your promotion. And you may push on that, and you may say, well, Buck, what if I don't feel like it? I don't feel like it. Well, come on. Sometimes you have to do things, behave before you feel things, right? I mean, we all get this in life. I want to feel healthy and I want to feel skinny. But I got to behave at the gym. I got to behave in front of the refrigerator before I begin to feel what I desire to feel. Perhaps you need to behave before you feel. When it comes to jealousy, it's to celebrate. And I'm telling you, when you say it out loud, it sets you free from jealousy. So, to wrap it up, as you look at the whole thing, which one of these do you resonate with the most? Which one of these, as you kind of walk in here, that you're kind of going, oh, and we're having this discussion, or you're going, I think this is the one. For me, one of the things I do with my boys all the time is at night or in the car, maybe at breakfast or at lunch, I'll ask them this question. I'll say, boys, how's your heart? How's your heart? Anything in there we need to talk about? You angry about anything? Is there anything in life you feel is not fair? Is there anything I've done to make you upset with me? Is there any secrets in there? Is there anything you don't want to tell me, but you know you need to tell me? And I've done that for years and years and years. And today, with my boys being older, especially my older boys, when I ask them this question, how's your heart? Do you know how they answer it? My oldest son, Sam, will do this all the time. He's like, Dad, it's fine. It's fine. My heart's fine. There's nothing in it. I'm not mad about anything. I think life's fair. You haven't done anything to upset me. I don't have any secrets. I don't, Dad. I promise. There's nothing. And I hear that. And when I hear that, as a father, what happens inside of me? There's a piece of me that's so joyful because they're discovering how to monitor and guard their hearts. So let me ask you, how's your heart? Anything happening inside of there? You angry about anything? You feel like life's unfair? Are you carrying around the hurt in life? How's your heart? Because the bottom line is this: above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your love. Thank you for this discussion. And God, today I just pray, as difficult as this discussion is, which you know it is, that you would meet us, that you would open our eyes to the area that we need to address, and that you would give us courage to put a personal guardrail around it. Teach us what that looks like. I trust you with that in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.